How's it going, you guys? So in this video I just want to bring awareness to some of the oldest low-carb / keto doctors in the field because there's a lot of talk about how ketogenic diets increase cortisol and decrease lifespan and stuff like that. But the reality is we actually have quite a few ketogenic and low-carb doctors and scientists who have been on this diet for decades, treating patients clinically and publishing amazing works of science in their field. And they're living into their 60s, 70s, and even 80s for some of them. I constantly see comments from vegans that claim that there are no low-carb doctors that live past the age of 60 and things like that, when the reality is there actually are quite a few. It's just that people don't hear about the greatest scientists in the field of low-carb living. We mostly know of like these YouTube celebrities and things, but many of these keto people, people who follow ketogenic diets or people who talk down on keto, aren't even aware of like the greatest pioneers in the ketogenic and low carb fields. So first of all, we have Dr. Eric Westman, who has been publishing books and articles and even research papers on ketogenic diets for around 30 years. Okay, so it's been decades. And he was one of the first doctors, alongside Dr. Atkins, who were involved in trying to change public policy on nutrition, like the USDA food pyramid and things like that. And one of the very first doctors, besides Dr. Atkins, who were actually using keto and low-carb diets to treat morbid obesity, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome using low-carb and keto diets. He's also an associate professor in medicine at Duke University. And he is 71 years old, as far as I can tell from searching up these people's birth dates on Google. And you'll find various clips of them in their lectures where they briefly mention how old they are, but they don't go around bragging about it like some of these other doctors do, like these vegan doctors. Anyway, so Dr. Eric Westman, 71 years old, no history of previous diseases of any kind, especially cardiovascular disease, and seems to be extremely healthy, looks healthy, has a very calm and professional demeanor, and is living the life. So next on the list, I'm going to talk about Dr. Stefan Finney. So Dr. Stefan Finney is approximately 72 years old, give or take, 72 years old, Dr. Stephen Finney, and he's been in the game as long or longer as Dr. Eric Westman. So again, multiple decades of pioneering the low-carb research. Both Dr. Eric Westman and Stephen Finney, Stephen Finney's been publishing research since 83. Since before 83, so since the late 1970s, early 80s. And Stephen Finney's been on keto / low carb diet since before he even began publishing research on the subject. And Stephen Finney, together with Dr. Eric Westman and Jeff Bullock, are largely, in my opinion, responsible for bringing ketogenic diets into the serious medical scientific discussion. Between Stephen Finney and Jeff Bullock, they've published, hundreds of peer-reviewed studies on the effects of low-carb diets and ketones on things like diabetes, exercise performance, reactive oxygen species, and the list goes on. They are the pioneers in the research, and they are all contributing towards treating chronic disease with keto diets, and they have great success with it. So Stephen Finney, another high caliber, he's a He's a medical doctor and professor in medicine as well as nutrition and exercise science. PhD and medical doctor. So 73 years old, 72, 73, give or take. So another pioneer in the low carb field would be Dr. Michael Eads. Okay, so Dr. Michael Eads is 73 years old. From the information I could find, he was born on June 19th, 1947. Okay, and he has a wife, Dr. Mary Eads. So they're both medical doctors, and they published the book Protein Power. And together they've published, I'm thinking about around 20 books, give or take. And I have multiple copies of Protein Power just because it's such a fundamental piece of work in the low carb history and ketogenic medicine field. So using nutrition as medicine. So yeah, Michael Eads, I mean, again, he's been, in the game since the 80s as well. And he's 73 years old. And I'm assuming, I looked briefly, I couldn't find his wife's age or her birth date, but I'm assuming she's probably in the same age range as he is. And I know that they've both been on low carb diets for these decades. I know for a fact Michael Eads has, Dr. Michael Eads. And if you look at Michael Eads' presentations, I mean, look at all of these people I mentioned so far. Michael Eads, I mean, he is in great shape. He's lean, healthy looking. You don't see visceral fat or a gut. Dr. Eric Westman, lean, healthy looking. There's no documented cases of, any health problems. Stephen Finney as well, and Jeff Bullock. And with Michael Eads, what I want for you all to do, if you are not familiar with his work, is search up his amazing lecture. It's called Paleoanthropology and the Origins of the Paleo Diet. And he was one of the first people to bring this idea, one of the first doctors to really bring this idea of you don't need carbs, human beings thrive on a meat-based diet, and presenting this science. He was one of the pioneers of this carnivore movement, but he was never trying to be carnivore. In fact, his books, they recommend for diabetics and obesity patients to keep under 50 grams of carbs a day, and they mention it's okay to eat things like bread and stuff as long as you keep your carbs under 50. So they were never like this dogmatic carnivore people, but in his lectures, he was one of the first to talk about the ancient Egyptians having heart disease. Even the general population who eat a wheat-based diet devoid of saturated fats and protein, despite what these vegans will tell you. He was one of the first people to bring that to the mainstream. Amazing doctor, one of my favorite, some of my favorite lectures from Michael Eads. Obviously, Stephan Finney is another idol of mine. I guess, I don't know if you'd say idol, but a man who I am inspired by and respect very, very much. So there's another youngster, but he's approaching similar longevity in the low-carb field, and that's Gary Taubes. So Gary Taubes also has been in this low-carb movement, as far as I know, for approximately, has it been 20 years now? It's been almost 30 years now that Gary Taubes has been in the low-carb movement. Almost 30 years. It has been 20 years or more than 20 years now. And Gary Taubes is 64 years old, and he has no signs of slowing down for disease anytime soon. He's another prominent figure still publishing updated books to this day. In fact, as of the last 2 or 3 months, he just recently released The Case for Keto. And he's published books talking about how he believes sugar and insulin and mostly high glycemic load carbohydrates are the primary cause of disease. Good Calories, Bad Calories, and The Case Against Sugar, two of his most well-known works. I think The Case Against Sugar, personally, is one of his best works, because no matter what side of the nutrition paradigm you fall under, I think most people would find that book, at the very least, very informative and would help people understand the real history and dangers of sugar. And that's not just a normal carbohydrate. Anyway, we have one last doctor that I'm going to mention, although I don't know what his stance on carbohydrates are, because I'm less familiar with his work and I'm more familiar with his students. But Dr. Boyd Eden. So this is a prominent figure in a key figure in the paleo community. He was one of the very first scientists to focus in on studying paleo anthropology in relationship to nutrition and health outcomes. So Dr. Boyd Eden, and he's age 82 years old, born March 18th, 1938. Now, I don't know if he follows a low-carb diet or if he preaches a low-carb diet, but he looks very thin and healthy. And if you follow a paleo diet, so to speak, generally speaking, by following a paleo diet, it is very hard to get more than 200 grams of carbohydrates per day. And the average American, I've seen various statistics, but the average American gets anywhere from 300 to 600 grams of carbohydrates per day, mostly coming from refined carbohydrates, whether that's flour or wheat flour, pasta, or sugar, refined sugar. So a low-carb diet to the mainstream is about 100 to 150 grams per day. Whereas for me, low carb is 50 grams or less. All these other doctors I mentioned up to this point, they preach keto, under 50 grams per day. But Dr. Boyd Eden, as far as I know, he's in the paleo field, which is more like 100 to 150 grams per day. If we're talking, Lauren Cordain style paleo, where it's very strict fruit, non-starchy carb, non-starchy veg, and then meat, no dairy or anything like that. But regardless, he looks thin, he looks healthy, and he's still alive, but no one talks about him because he's kind of like Lauren Cordain. He's even less profile than Lauren Cordain. I don't even think he's published any books, really. But he was the associate professor of anthropology at Emory University, and also the clinical associate professor of radiology at Emory School of Medicine. And he was a medical director of the Olympic Village Polyclinic during the Centennial Olympic Games in 1966. And he was featured in the 2012 documentary, The Perfect Human Diet, which I believe I've seen. I think it was the one where it starts with a guy having a heart attack in the middle of a race or something, and then he studies paleo diets in order to remedy it. Anyway, so Boyd Eden, 82 years old, and he looks healthy in the lectures I've seen him in. Last lecture that I've seen him in was in 2015, and he was lean, he looked healthy and active, and he's 82 years old. Now, something I want to point out, though, is that every person I mentioned on this list, except for Boyd Eden, that I know of, those people for sure, number one, they follow a keto diet under 50 grams per day. They've been doing it for multiple decades. They're looking amazing, super healthy at their ages. All of them except for Gary Taubes are in their 70s, but Gary Taubes is 64, and he's gonna make his 70s, I can tell. And they follow the diet. Like, they're very passionate about they practice what they preach. Jeff Bullock, another one. I couldn't find any information on his age, but he looks like he might be in his 60s maybe. But I couldn't find his age, but he's up there as well. And I know there's others as well. There's Dr. Eric Berg. You know, he's a chiropractor, not really whatever you want to call him, but chiropractor Berg, who had a CAC scan of 0 a couple years ago. And he's approaching his 60s pretty soon. Also, Dr. Sean Baker, I forgot exactly how old he said he is, but I believe he's in his 50s. Rob Wolf, how old is Rob Wolf? I mean, he's been cycling back and forth between, you know, keto on most days and 150 grams of carbs other days. Let me see how old Rob Wolf is real quick. Let's see. Okay, so Rob Wolf is approaching 50. So in 2018, Rob Wolf was 46 years old. So, and Rob Wolf for sure is one of the healthiest, you know, he's one of the most active in his category. And if you don't know who Rob Wolf is, you need to subscribe to his YouTube channel, especially if you're into keto, low carb, and stuff like that, and you're into the science behind metabolic parameters and heart disease and stuff like that. Amazing resource of information, and I definitely recommend his book Wired to Eat and Sacred Cow. So yeah, these people have been pioneering the low carb field. They have not died yet. They have not slipped on ice like Dr. Atkins. You know, Dr. Atkins slipped on ice and then had swelling and edema and gained like 100 pounds in 2 weeks while he's in a coma on bed rest in the hospital leading up to his death. Then there's other people like Charles Poliquin. Charles Poliquin was a low carb advocate who was also one of the world's pioneering strength coaches who coached many Olympic level wrestlers and Olympic level athletes. And he died of a heart attack at like the age of 52, I think it was. And he had a history of heart disease. But something you got to understand about Charles Poliquin is it seems like he's been on anabolic drugs for decades leading up to his death. But obviously that's speculation. But he has a lot of signs of gear use, which significantly increases your risk of heart disease. But even more likely is that he was taking mega doses of omega-3 fish oil. He was a huge advocate for some crazy therapies, and I say crazy meaning like possibly causes of his heart issues. Mega dosing fish oil of up to like 60 grams of omega-3 per day. That's a lot of fish oil. So to get 60 grams of combined EPA and DHA, you've got to take like 9 or 10 tablespoons of fish oil a day or more. That's like more than that, like 14 tablespoons of fish oil a day. That's a lot of fish oil. But he recommended 40 to 60 grams of fish oil per day, or he was kind of suggesting that was it. He's a huge advocate of that. So for me personally, I believe having adequate fish oil or having adequate omega-3 status is extremely beneficial to health. Most of the science published on omega-3 shows within reasonable range. Supplemental EPA specifically, the EPA and DHA has all sorts of benefits for heart disease risk and inflammation, as well as depression and things like that, and sports performance recovery. But the problem is there is a such thing as too much omega-3. And I see a lot of these, a lot of populations of people, for example, the Inuit, for example, which is some controversy surrounding that, but they were consuming, the majority of their fats from high omega-3 sources. And there's a potential for an increased potential for stroke and all sorts of problems, especially if you're not getting your omega-3s from fish. If you're getting it from fish oil, there's a high potential for oxidation and increase in oxidative fats in the system, which could potentially put you at risk for heart disease. But again, just because something is supposedly healthy does not mean that you can take these insane dosages. Most of the literature on fish oil shows around 6 grams of combined EPA and DHA per day is the beneficial range. He was taking 10 times that amount per day. So, and then he blamed it on magnesium and deficiency in mercury fillings. So it was probably either the anabolic use or the fish oil. So one more person I want to mention is Vince Garanda. So Vince Garanda, and I made a video talking about this a couple years back, and I had all sorts of bodybuilding fanboy, meathead, juicehead people getting angry at me because I would talk about, because I was talking about the cause of Vince Garanda's death, and they were acting like it was disrespectful. But Vince Garanda lived to be about 79 years old, and he died, I believe, from heart failure. I believe it was heart failure. But keep in mind, heart failure is not the same thing as a heart attack. Yeah, heart failure. He died of heart failure. I was correct. So he was one of the first people who did this steak and eggs diet approach. And I think if he had carbs, it was like a carb cycling approach where they'd binge on carbs one day on the weekend, and then they'd be just pure steak and eggs the rest of the week. But the thing is, so he died at 79 of heart failure. And heart failure is not the same thing as plaquing of the artery and arterial sclerosis. Heart failure happens generally from stiffening of the arteries, not from blockages. So he was a huge advocate of supplementing these very high amounts of calcium. He said he was taking 1,000 milligrams to 2,000 milligrams a day of calcium, something like that. And he said it was to offset some of the jitteriness that low-carb diets cause. Now, he probably didn't know it at the time, but the jitteriness he probably felt was most likely from sodium deficiency. And bodybuilders around that time, and still to this day, believe sodium, for one, is unhealthy and increases blood pressure, but for two, it increases water weight and bloating, supposedly, not on low-carb diets, but so they were most likely under consuming sodium, which caused the jitteriness that he was claiming was relieved by calcium. But the calcium, when you consume high amounts, especially of calcium carbonate supplements like he was taking, you significantly increase the risk of calcification in the arteries and calcification elsewhere, and stiffening, and more specifically, magnesium relaxes the arteries, relaxes the organs, whereas calcium tends to stiffen things up. So I made the case in my video about Vince Garanda's death that his heart failure, not heart attack, but heart failure, was probably caused by the supplemental calcium. So overall in this video, we have multiple examples of low-carb / ketogenic advocates who are living well into their 70s. Some of them, living in their 60s, doing fine, probably going to reach their 70s. And a couple examples of people in their 50s. Dr. Eric Berg, Dr. Sean Baker, and then Rob Wolf, who's like in his late 40s, approaching 50. And then we have two examples of, bodybuilders, by the way. Charles Poliquin and then Vince Garanda. And I don't know enough about Vince Garanda to speculate steroid use, but if you look at his physique and consider the time that he was competing and everything, it is not unreasonable to suggest that he might have tinkered around with anabolics at his time. But looking at his physique, though, he has an amazing physique, and he looks like he might just have been at the peak of natural potential. And considering his high-protein, low-carb diet, it's very easy to sustain a ripped, lean, muscular physique with that nutrition protocol. But not only were they bodybuilders, which is a big culture that takes these anabolic drugs that put you at risk of dying of heart disease, but they were also advocates of some extreme supplement protocols. You know, Charles Poliquin with his megadoses of omega-3, you know, like 10 times the high range recommended amount, and Vince Garanda with his calcium supplementation. Beyond that, Vince Garanda, despite dying of heart failure, he died at 79 years old, which is still pretty old. Now, I know some people might be saying, oh, 79 years old, it's only a matter of time before these other low-carb doctors you mentioned also die at that age. But I do not see these other doctors I mentioned dying of heart failure at 79. I think that was a result of the extreme bodybuilding lifestyle and extreme supplementation. So anyway, one thing is for sure, if saturated fat and animal protein was the cause of heart disease and cancer, like these people say, I am pretty sure that all of these people I mentioned in this video would have died much earlier, or would have died by now, or they would have had some kind of documented case of heart disease or cancer or something like that. But that is not the case. In fact, these are all highly respected doctors and professors in their field who treat these issues using ketogenic nutrition. So with that being said, leave your question and comments down below and let me know if I missed anyone. If you know of any other low-carb doctors out there, or keto doctors, there was another one, I think his name was like Stephen Van something, who originated the paleo diet along with Rob Wolf and Lauren Cordain. But let me know if I missed anyone. Post your question, comments down below, and I'll talk to y'all very soon.